good afternoon, maybe. I hope you're all having a fab time wherever you are, and welcome to the second round of the JRPG Showdown, where I pit 4 JRPGs that I haven't had a chance to talk about yet, give you some of my thoughts and aspects of what makes a JRPG, and give you which one I think takes the top spot. Our first contestant today is Trails of Cold Steel 4. Now, I've already talked about this game series previously in my previous JRPG Showdown. I'll put the link down in the description below. And this one follows directly after the events of the third game, which I talked about. In fact, it feels like a part 2 of the third game more than it does a fourth game in itself. It uses the exact same mechanics, engine, gameplay. Besides its continuation of the story, there's nothing in here really that makes it stand out from its previous game. And whilst I really enjoyed this series, the fact that it brings almost nothing new to the table besides some extra characters to play as makes for a bit of a disappointing feeling. Obviously, this doesn't apply to the story, which does well to match its predecessor in having an absolute mammoth of content to dive into. And like I've talked about with the previous games, if you want to sink your teeth into something, this series is the perfect place to do so. Granted, having 4 Harry Potter books worth of story shoved into one game might be off-putting for some. I think the bottom line becomes that it's a relatively charming and endearing story that can have its cliche anime tropes. Being the finale of a 4-part game series, it's also filled to the brim with fan service moments, which for me did eventually get dull and repetitive. And for being this big finale, there was a surprisingly lack of consequences for any of the characters involved, which was really frustrating to watch. Being that level design, immersion, and gameplay was identical to the previous one I reviewed, I ended up skimming this one as quickly as possible just to soak in the new story elements. Actually, I take that back. Gameplay was more frustrating because you reach the end of the third game with all of your powers, your items, your skills, and your top level, only to essentially lose all of that progress and start from square one all over again, with our story carrying on like nothing changed. And as far as big finales go, it was a nice finale. I just wish I could have gotten more invested. This might have also been because I played the fourth directly after having finished the third, and both of them being 50-hour content games might have been a bit too overwhelming for me. I definitely recommend some breathing space. Moving on is a little bit of a cheat because it's a DLC episode, but hey, it's my video, I'll talk about what I want. But yeah, this is Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. One of my first videos was actually about Final Fantasy VII Remake, so I don't want to go too much into repeating myself. You can check out that video in the description below. I do, however, want to talk about my transition onto the PS5, as well as trying this game out on hard mode, which was insanely entertaining. I'm not normally one to replay a game on a harder setting, however I felt inclined to do so before tucking into the PS5 DLC, that is Intergrade. In the harder setting, you're not allowed to use items. Ever. And god, does that change the dynamic of how you play this game. It also makes you appreciate how fun the core battle mechanics are. Because in order to beat the game, you can only really rely on healing from spells or benches which are placed sporadically across the game. That, and you can only ever restore your MP from doing main chapters and side quests. So it really forces you to manage your spells, including Cure, more carefully. Now all of a sudden, instead of bashing through fights, I'm now studying each enemy and learning their weaknesses. Otherwise, I'm going to be wasting a lot of health. I'm also trying to learn their fight patterns so I can dodge more easily and switch to more appropriate characters. The PS5 upgrade also makes the game's loading insanely short, and many of the background textures were upgraded. So this game was a huge win. But for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to talk about Intergrade, the DLC on PS5, which focuses on the story of Yuffie during the main events of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Gameplay wise, it was obviously pretty familiar, the difference here being that you can only play as one character, Yuffie. You also have one other teammate who you can assign commands to, but not play firsthand. And the combat feels incredible. Even with it being just one character, it feels so unique to the main game. The healthy combination of up close and far reaching mechanics, making the best use of an iconic weapon. Even going as far as to incorporate it into the world exploration and the item gathering. It was always fun learning new moves and finding different ways to play off your partner for bonus staggering damage. Story wise for a DLC, it wasn't too bad either. You play through the same timeline as the main game, however you take this exterior point of view, seeing what was going on in certain towns and places where your main characters from the main game had just left the scene. It's not huge, but it's still enough to warrant buying, I think. They do well to give you loads of teasers into the next game as well, which I enjoyed. And this kind of ties well into the immersion of the game as well, where story elements and character conversations were all voiced and conversations were taking place fluidly during both cutscenes and gameplay. It makes you never feel like you're putting your controller down for too long of a time just watching a movie. I think a healthy balance like that is good, and I enjoyed the way 7 Remake and Intergrade both told their stories. As far as level design goes, this one's pretty hard to judge. It basically borrows all of the levels from the main game, so there's not really anything new in that regard, apart from a new factory setting, which is different, but besides from that, all felt very familiar to the main game. Which was the point of it, I guess. So similarly to the main game, they were detailed and high quality, but aside from the town, there wasn't much in the way of exploration. It felt very linear with not much purpose in backtracking, which was a shame because I loved the way Yuffie played and would have taken any excuse to play more of her. My total playtime was about 10 hours, and that was an enjoyable ride start to finish. I feel like 10 hours for extra DLC chapter isn't too shabby, to be honest. I didn't do all the bonus missions and bosses, but enough to consider it decent, satisfying playthrough. Our third contestant is Tales of Arise, and Christ alive, what a game. First off, it's fair to say I'm a big fan of the Tales of series, but haven't really been all that impressed with the last few mainline games. I actually talked about Tales of Berseria in my last comparison video, which you can check in the description below again. But there was a lot of things that needed improving, and the story was about the only thing that was going for it that I was remotely interested in. But this is such an improvement from Berseria that it's almost hard to tell they're from the same franchise sometimes. The biggest change from the previous title is the overhaul in the appearance that's been done, still keeping to that anime style, but instead incorporating this mixture in art style which is a blend of watercolouring and cell shading to make this fantastic and unique visual look. And the bottom line is that this game is stunning. Everything from character to world design looks sharp, original and wonderful. Which I suppose segues into my next point, an area which I also feel like Tales of Berseria lacked in immensely, and that was level design. This newfound look and design is coupled with some truly unique looking areas to explore in a much less linear format. Each landscape, town and dungeon had its own element that made it very unique, with hidden areas both high and low, which surprisingly being one of the first Tales games to incorporate a jump button into the open world exploration, opened so many more doors and ways to traverse around this vast world. It went from being one of the worst aspects to one game to becoming the best aspect of another. And the only negative side that I can find was the lack of monster variety. Now, Tales games are notorious for using the same monsters but recolouring them later down the story, and it's never been too noticeable until now. I think with the improved visuals, the game was screaming for more types of enemies to face off against, especially when it made battling them feel so repetitive. Which I guess segues into my next section, the gameplay. Battling has had a bit of an overhaul as well, swapping out that terrible art chain basic attacking system from Berseria, reverting back to having original standard attacks with arts as special moves. This time though, combat has been elevated into the air, with each character being able to use different arts on the ground versus in the air, with great emphasis on swapping and combining between both. This makes for a more dynamic and exciting play, with plenty of special moves for each character to try out. And speaking of characters, each of the 6 playable characters felt so different and fun to play in their own ways, each having perks against different types of enemies, making players feel justified in using each character throughout the story. Usually, I tend to lean heavily towards the main character, however, I can happily say that I used each person a decent amount of times throughout my game. This game can be really challenging as well, with fun and unique bosses but alongside some really tanky health bars, with a new system which limits how many healing moves you can use through a CP system. The only way to replenish CP outside of sleeping at campsites and inns are through very expensive healing items, which encourage players to think more tactically about defeating enemies, as healing was no longer an easy, unlimited resource. And I need not say much about the immersion of the game either. Cutscenes were dynamic, plentiful and so enjoyable to watch. Nearly everything was voice acted as well, although some side quests and small dialogues weren't, which was a little bit odd, I will say. But other than that, there was dialogue and conversations happening whilst travelling and fighting, which helped draw you into the world and characters further. My only criticism would be the music. Not in that the songs were poor or I didn't like the soundtrack, but they chose questionable tracks sometimes in certain scenes and events. Meaning you'd have times where you can't even hear the character's dialogue because the orchestra in the song was way too overbearing. And story-wise, I'm not going to spoil anything, but this was probably the most divisive aspect amongst fans online that I've seen. Some seem to find this bland and generic, whilst others have taken to this plot finding it emotional, exciting, and driven with lovable characters. For me, I definitely leaned towards the latter. Whilst it may not have pushed boundaries in any narrative way, I really enjoyed the Tales franchise sinking back into its roots of good and evil and the bonds you make along the way. It's honestly up there with one of my favourite narratives in the franchise, and I loved every playable character, both personality and story-wise. I enjoyed this game so much that I found myself naturally 100%ing this on my first playthrough, finishing off with a 65-hour runtime, including some nice tidbits from crossover DLCs, albeit not plenty. To me, it was just such a leap forward from Berseria, and those who preferred Berseria for their characters, hopefully we can have a new title down the line which incorporates what made Arise successful and combine it with more inspired characters. And our final contestant today is the Ruined King. Ah, damn it. I wanted to love this one. I really did. I'm a fan of League of Legends and was always wanting a spin-off game which could dive more into the lore of the characters. So I jumped on this straight away after it came out. And it was very much two opposing feelings I had with this game. And it's about halfway through my playthrough where the thoughts changed on this game. Story-wise, it's fine. It's great to see more of the characters and learn more about the pirate run town of Bilgewater. First half of the game I was very keen and interested to learn more on what happened, but I just felt like I wasn't rewarded with enough story. Which sounds strange, I know, but for the work and effort I felt the game put you through, I don't think there was much progress in storytelling to reward you for it, until you reached near the end of the game where unfortunately I just lost that drive. Immersion and character-wise, I think each teammate was given good personalities, and when there was voiced dialogue between each other, I very much enjoyed it, but it felt few and far in between. When they would converse, it didn't feel like much of importance was being said either. It just felt empty, and that might very well be because they were limited to the changes and additions to the characters they could do as they were all part of a bigger game. It also didn't help that there wasn't really much music to this game either. Background music was there, but it was mellow and uneventful, and it didn't help with the next aspect of the game either. And that was level design. Traversing this world, whilst it did have a nice art style to the game, slowly became quite dull. Especially as quick travel back to old locations and objectives is somewhat limiting. You're forced to spend a lot of time retreading steps, and whilst I very much rate the pirate town of Bilgewater, half the game is spent elsewhere in the Shadow Isles, which I felt was really limiting in appeal. Everything looks exactly the same, with a background track that loops in a weird, ominous siren every 15 seconds, almost made me want to turn off the volume on my TV and listen to my own music. Although, I suppose you're never in the open world for too long, as there tends to be a healthy amount of enemies thrown into every area of the game, forcing you to experience our final point, and that's gameplay. This was an aspect of the game I was really excited to explore when I first saw the trailers. However, with everything else letting me down, there was far too much pressure on the gameplay to be good enough to keep me interested, and unfortunately it just couldn't do it. It goes for a turn-based laning battle system where you use a combination of normal attacks and special abilities to attack your opposing foes. Turns are shown below, and each move has 3 variations of fast, normal or strong, which would affect the delay on your next move. On paper that sounds great and tactical, but if you spent enough time investing into your normal attacks, which didn't take any time to wait to use and gave little delay, they did as much damage as your abilities, and unless your special ability purpose was to heal you, it felt unnecessary to use them that frequently. Now that's obviously a very top level summary of the problem, but I don't want to drag out this video any more than I need to. So I ended up finding the gameplay repetitive, especially as there were so many enemies on the map. You start to find the fights a bit stale. I ended up switching to story mode just to blitz through the game as quickly as possible and reach the end, and I didn't even get that far. After 16.5 hours, I ended up dropping this. So there you have it, that's my rundown of our 4 games today. Putting each one together for me, the table looks like this. Mostly the same scores for Trails of Cold Steel 4 as for Cold Steel 3, although with no innovation or any change for that fact, it got stale quickly and I ended up skipping everything just to see the main story finale. Hopefully from the franchise moving forward, they can take a page out of the Tales franchise books and not be afraid to shake up the combat and include more user-friendly dialogue scenes through the game with consistency in its voice acting. Final Fantasy Intergrade was truly great, but I feel it's a cheat giving it high values for level design when it's borrowing a lot of that from its main game. Even then, music, story and gameplay was amazing for what's considered to be a bonus chapter DLC. Tales of Arise really shone in my eyes, with near perfect scores if but not for one thing, and that's monster variety. Such a small selection of unique enemies in each area, and it can even learn from Intergrade in the respect that make enemies feel more unique, requiring different tactics to kill them, instead of necessarily making it a hack and slash and the same enemy with slight recolorings. Boss fights thankfully didn't follow that trend, and the Ruin King, I really wanted to, and the story was getting there, but it just wasn't enough to pull me through the other elements I didn't like. But looking at the whole picture, it's clear to see for me, the winner was Tales of Arise. There we have it. Hopefully you found this video interesting, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you've played these 4 games and thought differently on them, let me know down in the comments below. What was your favourite out of the 4? If you liked this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. It always helps out. And as always, stay tuned for more reviews on movies, anime and video games. Until next time, guys, take care. Bye bye.